Sorry to interrupt the member. I call Gareth Hughes.
Kia ora, Mr Speaker. The Green Party can see no justification for this legislation, and we agree with the majority of the submitters that the likely outcome of this bill is going to be damaging to our tertiary education sector. This bill takes us backwards. This bill is an ideological problem in search of a solution. The impacts on students, on the sector, on the economy are going to be severe. With very minimal student or institutional demand, this bill is going to damage students. There's been hardly any demand from any students whatsoever. We heard from a tiny ideological minority who couldn't convince students, their colleagues, their peers, through the current arrangement, which is a petition or a referendum. So what they did is use the ACT Party, to use the National Party as a vehicle to achieve their minority ideological interests. We'll be voting against this bill because of what's in this bill, but what's also not in this explanatory statement. We believe the underlying objective of this bill is to weaken student associations and undermine their membership, their financial viability, and in doing so reduce student democracy, student participation, and a student's voice on university and polytechnic boards. This bill also serves another purpose, which is a smokescreen to cover what the other changes in the sector are. This government has made studying less accessible, less affordable, and in some cases downright impossible, as they shut the door to students that have the grades and the money to study. Surely facing the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, we want more people to get skilled, we want more people with qualifications, but what this government is doing is cutting the tertiary funds, making it less accessible, less affordable, and in some cases downright impossible. This bill is convenient in the short term, because students' attention, rightly so, has been on focusing on protecting their existence. It's convenient to the government in the long term because it's going to reduce students' organisation and ability to critique government policy. The irony of this bill is it takes away students' right to choose the membership system best for them. It takes away that compromise agreement reached in 2001, which lets students choose whether they want to be voluntary or universal via a petition and a referendum. The bill aims to uphold a very debatable, very controversial interpretation of the right of freedom of association. The majority of student associations operate under a compulsory membership model whereby any student can, though we heard only a tiny fraction actually do choose to opt out of their student association membership. If there's a problem to be fixed, surely it's simply to make that opt-out provision clearer, more accessible, more easy to understand. If there's a problem with corruption and misspending, we could have dealt with that. If there's a problem with bad decision-making, we could have dealt with that. That was a massive missed opportunity and something which frankly occurs all too much in this House as well. The tragedy is we could have tweaked the system, but instead we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The committee, and it was a privilege to sit with the other members, and I acknowledge the other members because they went to it with a real sense of what I thought was critical engagement. There were some good questions. We heard from some 180 oral submitters and more than 4,800 written submissions. Some 98% of these submissions were opposed. We heard from a tiny and ideological minority who supported the bill. They presented a grim economic view of a university as simply a place where students go to maximise their employment outcomes, where students go to sit, to listen and to go home again. They presented a university without the people, without the culture, without an atmosphere. We heard from students, associations, institutions, city officials. We heard from cultural clubs, sporting clubs and support networks. We heard from a broad range of people. We didn't hear from student radicals or just from students. We heard from real people with real concerns about this bill, which unfortunately have been ignored. The overwhelming majority of the submissions opposed the bill and cited the considerable expected negative impact on student associations' ability to effectively deliver services, advocacy and representation. Services which tertiary providers will not be able to provide with the same level of skills, without the same level of cost, and with the current budgetary constraints aren't going to do as good a job. We heard from students that they don't have $100 or $200 burning a hole in their pocket at the beginning of the year to join a voluntary association. Students, especially in their first years, don't know what to expect, don't know what they'll need down the line. And they've already got to outlay thousands of dollars on books, on bond, on rent. I want to ask the National Party members, what did you tell your caucus? Why couldn't you convince your caucus to oppose this bill for the practical reasons we've discussed tonight? Or did the minister decide? Did the minister say we have to support this bill as a smokescreen to reduce representation? What the options student associations have now is they've got the option to slash services, they've got the option to sell assets, or they've got the option to sign a service agreement with the institution. We heard from university associations like Waikato that went down this path, went down a voluntary model, and what they told us was they've been spending the last 10 years recovering from the 3 years under a VSM. We heard about the assets built up over decades by the student body which were flogged off. What we're going to see across the country is a slashing of services. We're going to see slashing to university sport, which is going to lead to less Olympians. We're going to see cuts to the magazines, the radio, the legal advice, welfare, minority groups like UniQ, Pacifica groups, cultural clubs, supporting sexual abuse survivors. This is going to impact students. This is going to impact their pass rates at the same time the government is making this one of their priorities. It's going to affect their advocacy and their representation. The government tonight have said that we're fear-mongering, we're doom-gloomers. But what we're not just talking about predictions. Across the ditch, we had an experiment. And what we found in Australia, when they introduced this legislation in 2005, it was a catastrophe. And that's why they're undoing it now. That's why they're undoing it now, and the government has had to stump up $120 million in Australia. Across the ditch, we saw them sell off the assets, and that's what's going to happen here as this bill proceeds. Assets built up by students, slowly squirreling away a tiny amount of money every year, building up their asset base. This is going to be flogged. We're going to see service agreements being signed by the institutions with the student associations. We heard from institutions from across the country, from Polytech and universities, that they appreciate the work, the support of student associations, and often they'll sign a contract with them. In Auckland, which is the only university at the moment with a VSM model, we heard from the President who said the association survives despite, not because, of voluntary student membership. We heard that their independence had been irredeemably compromised. The university has already used the threat of pulling the funding to the association to keep them under their thumb, to make sure the association does what they want. And a key question for the Minister of Tertiary Affairs now is, will he cap the student levy funding? Will he further weaken student associations? I want to ask the Minister how much money has been put aside for the transition. Has this discussion even been had? The irony is, from this bill, that the services still have to go on, someone has to provide them, but what's going to happen is they're going to happen without students having a say, without their representation. We agree with the submitters' concerns that the impact on student association membership and funding levels is going to be catastrophic. This is going to have long-term impacts for our universities, our economy and our democracy. We're sowing massive uncertainty to the student body for next year and the year after. How are people going to join their student association? Do they do it at the beginning of the year? Do they need ID? Can they put it on their student loan? Only once at enrolment? None of these questions have been dealt with. Probably one of the biggest costs of the process over the last few months has been the opportunity cost. We could have done good work. We could have made the great work that associations do better. We could have worked out the opt-out provision clause. We could have made provisions around better use and better accountability and transparency of student money and decision making. We heard from a whole bunch of new tools we could be using to encourage democratic participation. But instead, why are we doing this? We're doing this not because to save money, not to make a university a nicer place, a better place, or to get more passes rates for our students. What we have is a thinly veiled effort to establish a way to shut down youth voices, youth representation, student voices, student services, and make being a student in New Zealand just a little bit harder. I want to thank all the submitters that did great work throughout the long but very interesting submission process. I want to thank the hours of work that went into it, but I lament all the other things you could have been campaigning on this year that the government's been doing. In summary, Mr. Speaker, I support students' rights to choose